echoes of the frost and the soldier's choice. Winter in New York City was never just a season. It was an adversary. The morning air was a sharp, invisible blade that cut through wool coats and numbed the faces of the millions rushing toward their glass towers. Snow, which had fallen in a heavy, silent blanket overnight, now clung to the cornices of pre-war buildings and turned the aggressive angles of the metropolis into something softer, yet more fragile. White plumes of steam rose from the subway vents, spiraling into the leaden sky like the weary ghosts of the city's industrial past. Beneath the biting cold, the distant hum of traffic throbbed like a heartbeat, relentless and indifferent. On a sidewalk near 72nd Street, the rhythm of the city faltered for no one. Heels clicked against the frozen pavement, and heavy boots hammered the slush, creating a frantic percussion of people who were perpetually late. Amidst the sea of motion, a rusted iron cage sat abandoned against a frost-covered lamp post. It was a jarring sight, an object of entrapment in a city that preached freedom. A piece of cardboard, soaked through at the edges and held by peeling tape, bore a message scrawled in thick, black permanent marker, "For sale." Inside the cage, the reality was even bleaker. A female German shepherd, her ribs visible beneath a coat dulled by malnutrition, was curled into a tight, protective ball. She wasn't just cold. She was hollowed out. Tucked into the curve of her belly were two puppies, no more than a few weeks old. Their tiny bodies trembled with a rhythmic, desperate shivering that seemed to be the only thing keeping them alive. Frost had turned their whiskers white, and their breath came in shallow, panicked puffs that vanished the moment they hit the air. They were past the point of whimpering. They were simply waiting for the end. Caleb Morgan moved through the crowd like a man accustomed to long, lonely roads. At 38, his posture still carried the rigid discipline of a soldier, though the uniform he had worn for nearly 2 decades was now just a memory folded away in a trunk. He was a tall man, with shoulders broadened by endurance rather than vanity. His dark hair was cropped short, showing a dusting of premature gray at the temples, and his jawline was defined by a habitual tightness, a remnant of years spent in places where silence was a survival tactic. He had been back for 3 months, but the word home still tasted like ash in his mouth. Every night, the hum of his refrigerator transformed into the drone of a long-range patrol vehicle, and the honking of taxis became the distant echo of sirens in a war zone. To Caleb, the peace of the city felt like a different form of exile. He walked the streets not because he had a destination, but because the movement convinced him he was still moving forward. He saw the cage from half a block away. At first, he thought it was discarded trash, but as he drew closer, the "For Sale" sign caught his eye. His pace slowed. Around him, the humanity of New York continued its transit. A woman in a designer red coat glanced down, whispered "poor things," and then stepped over a puddle without breaking her stride. A man on a cell phone cursed at the weather, oblivious to the 3 lives freezing inches from his feet. Something deep within Caleb's chest, a place he had kept barricaded behind iron doors, cracked. He didn't feel anger yet. He felt recognition. He had seen that look before, the wide-eyed, vacant stare of a living being that had realized help was never coming. He had seen it in the eyes of stray dogs in Kabul, and he had seen it in his own reflection after too many funerals. Without a word, Caleb knelt into the grimy snow. The cold seeped through his worn trousers, but he didn't care. As he approached the cage, the mother dog's ears twitched. She didn't snarl or snap. She simply raised her head with an agonizing effort, her deep brown eyes meeting his gray ones. In that gaze, there was a silent, ancient question. Are you the one who finishes us, or the one who saves us? Easy now, Caleb murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to cut through the wind. I'm not going to hurt you, I promise. He removed one of his gloves, exposing his hand to the biting frost. He didn't reach in to grab them. He simply held his hand near the bars, letting the mother catch his scent. The scent of old leather, wood smoke, and a quiet, steady strength. She leaned forward, her frozen nose twitching, and for a fleeting second, her tongue brushed his knuckles. It was a gesture of monumental trust, offered by a creature that had been given every reason to hate the world. 6 stories above the street, Margaret Holloway stood by her frosted window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. At 75, with silver hair and a home filled with the scent of old books, she spent her days observing the world from behind the glass. Since the death of her husband, a man who had returned from his own war with shadows in his eyes, the winters felt longer and the world seemed colder. She had been watching the cage since dawn, her heart aching with an impotence that felt like a physical weight. But then, she saw the man in the faded camouflage jacket. She saw the way he knelt, not with the casual pity of a passerby, but with the profound respect of a protector. She recognized the stillness in his shoulders, the way he occupied space. "Don't leave them," she whispered against the glass, her breath fogging the pain. "Please, don't let them die out there." Down on the sidewalk, Caleb felt the weight of the moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside were $40, his food money for the next 4 days. He looked at the for sale sign, then looked across the street at a vendor selling roasted chestnuts. Caleb stood up, walked to the vendor, and handed him the money. "I'm taking the dogs," Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The money is for the person who left them. If they come back, tell them the debt is paid, and if I ever see them, they'll wish they'd stayed in the shadows." The vendor, a man who had seen everything the city had to throw at him, nodded slowly. "They're yours, soldier. Take 'em before the ice wins." Caleb returned to the cage. He draped his own heavy jacket over the metal bars to trap whatever warmth remained. As he lifted the heavy, rusted contraption, he felt the mother dog shift her weight, pressing closer to his shins through the bars. He began to walk, his footsteps heavy and purposeful in the snow. He didn't know how he would afford to feed them or how his landlord would react, or how he would heal the trauma in their eyes. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 months, his hands weren't shaking. He had a mission. As he turned the corner, leaving the indifferent crowd behind, the snow began to fall more heavily, but the air no longer felt quite so cold. A soldier had made his choice, and in the heart of the frost, a new story was beginning to breathe. Shadows in the snow and the strength of kinship. The drive to Brooklyn was a blur of gray slush and rhythmic windshield wipers. Caleb's old blue pickup truck, a vehicle that had survived years of neglect and salted roads, rattled as it climbed the bridge. In the back, tucked into the cab's small rear bench, the iron cage sat wrapped in the heavy wool blankets provided by the woman from the coffee shop. He could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of claws against metal, a sound of life, however fragile. Caleb's apartment was located in a tired brick building where the hallways always smelled of floor wax and boiled cabbage. It was a space designed for a man who didn't plan on staying long. The walls were nearly bare, save for a single framed photograph of his unit in the desert and a wooden cross near the door. The furniture was sparse. A twin-sized bed, a sturdy wooden table, and a radiator that hissed and clanked like a steam engine but rarely produced enough heat to ward off the winter chill. As he carried the cage up the 3 flights of narrow stairs, the weight of the responsibility settled into his bones. He wasn't just carrying animals. He was carrying a debt to his own humanity. Once inside, he set the cage down on a frayed wool rug near the radiator. His movements were precise, a habit of a man used to working in tight quarters. He knelt, his fingers numbed by the walk from the truck, and fumbled with the rusted latch. "You're safe now," he whispered, more to convince himself than them. "The sidewalk is over." He opened the door and waited. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then the mother dog tentatively poked her muzzle out. She sniffed the air, scents of old wood, coffee, and the faint metallic tang of the heater. Slowly, she crawled out, her legs trembling so violently she nearly collapsed. She didn't look for food. She didn't look for an exit. She immediately turned and nudged her 2 puppies out of the cage with her nose. Caleb watched them. They were tiny, clumsy things, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and curiosity. He realized then that they needed names not just for identification but to give them a place in the world. He looked at the mother. Despite the filth and the starvation, She moved with a quiet, regal dignity. Grace, he decided. He looked at the larger, more adventurous pup who was already sniffing his boot. You're Ranger. Then he turned to the smallest one, the one whose breath was still a bit too ragged. And you're Milo. He spent the next hour performing a different kind of triage. He boiled a pot of rice and mixed it with a tin of ham, the best he had in his cupboard. The smell of the warm food filled the room, and for the first time, Grace's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. She ate slowly, occasionally stopping to push the bowl toward her pups, a display of maternal selflessness that made a lump form in Caleb's throat. The next morning, the reality of their condition became clearer. Caleb took them to a small veterinary clinic tucked between a laundry and a bakery. Dr. Allison Grant, a woman with sharp eyes and a gentle touch, examined them under the bright fluorescent lights. Her expression shifted from professional concern to a cold, simmering anger as she ran her hands over Grace's flanks. These aren't just abandoned dogs, Caleb, she said, her voice tight. She pointed to a series of jagged scars near Grace's hindquarters and the way her teeth had been worn down. She's been overbred. Forced litters, likely in a dark basement or a cramped shed. She was part of a clandestine breeding ring. When she couldn't produce enough merchandise anymore, or when she got too sick to manage, they dumped her like trash. Caleb felt a familiar coldness wash over him, the same coldness he felt when he encountered senseless cruelty in the field. And the puppies? They're weak, but they'll make it if they stay warm and fed. But listen to me, she warned, looking him in the eye. The people who run these operations, they don't like losing their property. If they think they can still get a few $100s for those pups, they might not stay away. Caleb nodded, his jaw tightening. Let them try. The warning haunted him as he returned home. The transition from soldier to civilian had left him feeling useless, but now he had a perimeter to defend. He began to notice things. A soldier's mind never truly turns off. It just looks for different threats. 2 days later, the shadows appeared. It started with the footprints. Caleb went down to take out the trash and paused at the entrance of the building. In the fresh layer of snow, there were deep, heavy imprints of work boots. They didn't belong to any of his neighbors. They had approached his door, lingered for a while, and then retreated toward the street. There were no outgoing tracks. Whoever it was had waited for a long time before vanishing into the shadows of an alley. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Brooklyn skyline, a dark van with tinted windows and no license plate began idling at the corner. It sat there for an hour, its exhaust pluming into the cold air like a signal fire. Grace felt it, too. She stood by the door, a low, guttural growl vibrating in her chest, her hackles raised. Caleb sat in the dark, his back against the wall, a position that allowed him to see both the window and the door. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert. He felt a hand on his shoulder and jumped. It was Margaret. She had let herself in with the spare key he'd given her for emergencies. You saw them, didn't you? She asked, her voice a soft tremor. 2 men. They were standing under the street lamp last night, looking up at your window. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't know if I was just an old woman seeing ghosts. You weren't seeing ghosts, Margaret, Caleb said, his eyes fixed on the street. They're real. He realized then that he couldn't just hide. He had spent his life reacting to the world. It was time to take the initiative. He called the local precinct, but the officer on the phone was dismissive. It's a city of 8 million people, Mr. Morgan. Footprints and a van aren't a crime. Call us if someone actually tries to break in. Caleb hung up. He knew that waiting for the break-in was often too late. The climax of the tension came the following night. A heavy sleet had turned the streets into a glass-slick trap. Caleb decided to take Grace out for a quick walk, hoping the foul weather would keep the shadows at bay. He was wrong. As he stepped out of the building's side entrance, 2 men stepped out from behind a row of parked cars. One was tall and wiry, wearing a grease-stained parka. The other was shorter, built like a fire hydrant, holding a heavy iron bar. That's our dog, pal, the wiry one said, his voice a raspy snarl. And the pups she's got inside? Those belong to us, too. Hand over the leash, and maybe we don't break your legs." Caleb didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon because he didn't need one. He shifted his weight, his center of gravity lowering, his eyes scanning their hands, their eyes, their footing. It was a movement born of 1,000 hours of hand-to-hand combat training. "You made a mistake," Caleb said, his voice eerily calm. "You thought I was just a man with a dog. You didn't realize that I've been waiting for a reason to feel like myself again." The short man swung the iron bar. It was a clumsy, telegraphed move. Caleb stepped inside the arc of the swing, his palm striking the man's chin with the force of a hammer. As the short man crumpled, Caleb pivoted, catching the wiry one by the throat and pinning him against the brick wall of the building. "You listen to me?" Caleb hissed, his face inches from the man's terrified eyes. "You ever come near this building again, you ever think about these dogs, and I will find where you sleep. Do you understand?" The man managed a frantic nod. Just then, blue and red lights flooded the alleyway. Margaret had called the police after all, but she hadn't just reported a suspicious van. She had reported an active assault. Officer Reed, a veteran cop with a tired face, stepped out of the cruiser. He looked at the man on the ground, the man pinned to the wall, and the German shepherd standing calmly by Caleb's side. He looked at Caleb's eyes, the eyes of a man who was no longer an exile, but a protector. "I think you've got some explaining to do," Reed said, but there was a note of respect in his voice. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the two men were in custody, and their van had been searched. Inside, the police found 4 more dogs, all in crates, all terrified. Caleb's stand hadn't just saved Grace. It had cracked open a door into a world of cruelty that was finally being brought into the light. As Caleb walked back up his stairs, Grace leaned her head against his leg. He realized then that the strength of kinship wasn't just about the dogs. It was about the way the neighborhood, the vet, and even the law had finally started to look at the invisible. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a man who belonged to a pack. And for the first time since he'd left the service, Caleb Morgan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The final stand and the dawning of Grace. The silence that settled over Caleb's apartment following the arrests in the alleyway was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, charged stillness that lingers after a lightning strike. Outside, the New York winter was beginning to lose its grip, the snow turning into a gray, weeping slush that mirrored the exhaustion in Caleb's soul. He stood by the window, watching the rhythmic pulse of the city's lights, while Grace lay at his feet. Her flank bore a fresh, clean bandage where a blade had grazed her during the chaos of the confrontation. A shallow wound, but a deep reminder that the shadows he fought were not easily banished. The traffickers had been part of something larger, a network that viewed living creatures as nothing more than lines on a ledger. Caleb knew that by stepping out of the shadows to save Grace, he had made himself a target. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for an ambush. He felt like a man standing his ground. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of wet slate. Caleb had returned from a brief meeting with Evelyn Carter at the Animal Protection Foundation to find his apartment door slightly ajar. The sight sent a cold, familiar jolt through his nervous system, the instinct of a soldier who recognizes a perimeter breach. He entered slowly, his boots silent on the hardwood. The apartment had been ransacked. Chairs were overturned, blankets torn from the floor, and the small wooden cross near the door lay splintered. His heart hammered against his ribs as he called out for Grace. A faint, pained whimper led him to the bedroom. Grace was shielded in the corner, her body trembling, her eyes wide with a protective terror. Ranger and Milo were tucked beneath the bed, silent and shivering. On the kitchen table, the intruders had left a single, chilling message. A rusted, jagged choke collar that hadn't belonged to Grace. It was a promise of what would happen if Caleb didn't stop his interference. "It's okay," Caleb whispered, kneeling beside Grace and pulling her head to his chest. "They're gone. I've got you." As he cleaned up the wreckage of his home, Margaret appeared in the doorway. She didn't ask what happened. The broken furniture told the story. She walked over and picked up the splintered wooden cross, her hands steady despite her age. "Caleb," she said, her voice soft but ironclad. "My husband once told me that the war never really leaves a man, but he also said that the reason we fight is so that the world doesn't become a place where things like this are allowed to happen in silence. You aren't just protecting dogs anymore. You're protecting the idea that kindness still has a home here." Those words acted as a catalyst. Caleb realized that hiding was no longer an option. He contacted Evelyn Carter and provided the final pieces of information the authorities needed: the descriptions of the men, the license plate he'd memorized, and the location of the warehouse he'd tracked them to during his own restless nights of scouting. The raid happened 48 hours later. Caleb didn't carry a weapon, but he stood with the officers as they breached a nondescript warehouse on the industrial edge of Brooklyn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and despair. Dozens of cages were stacked to the ceiling, filled with dogs whose eyes reflected the same vacant, broken stare he had first seen in Grace. As the police led the traffickers away in handcuffs, Caleb walked through the rows of cages. He saw the merchandise being transformed back into living beings as rescuers moved in with warm blankets and soft words. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The mission was over. The network was shattered. The weeks that followed brought the dawning of Grace. Spring arrived in Brooklyn not with a roar, but with a persistent, gentle thawing. The trees in the small park near Caleb's building began to show the first tentative buds of green, and the air lost its jagged edge. In the apartment, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Grace no longer limped. Her coat had regained its lustrous sheen, and she moved with a quiet, watchful grace that suited her name. Ranger had grown into a boisterous, clumsy teenager who viewed every fallen leaf as a personal challenge, while Milo, though still small, had developed a quiet confidence, often seen napping with his head resting on Caleb's foot. But the change wasn't just inside the apartment. It was in the neighborhood itself. The soldier with the dogs had become a local legend. People who used to walk past Caleb without a glance now stopped to offer a smile or a word of encouragement. One morning, he found a bag of high-quality dog food and a handwritten note left at his door. "Thank you for not looking away." Margaret became a daily fixture in their lives. She would bring over books to read to the dogs, claiming they appreciated the cadence of poetry, and she and Caleb would sit in the fading afternoon light, sharing tea and stories. She told him about her husband's gentleness, and Caleb, for the first time, spoke about the things he had seen overseas, finding that the telling of them made the memories feel less like ghosts and more like history. One afternoon, Caleb sat at his wooden table and picked up the original for sale cardboard sign he had pulled from the cage on that first frozen morning. The black marker was faded, the edges frayed and water-stained. He looked at it for a long time, remembering the man he had been, lost, isolated, and drifting through a world that felt indifferent. He didn't throw the sign away. Instead, he placed it inside a small memory box he kept in the closet. It was no longer a symbol of a transaction. It was a testament to the moment his life had reclaimed its meaning. He realized that saving Grace hadn't been an act of charity. It had been a rescue mission for his own soul. Evelyn Carter eventually offered him a permanent role as a field coordinator for the foundation. He accepted, realizing that his skills as a soldier, his vigilance, his discipline, his courage, were exactly what was needed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He became the man who intervened when things got difficult, the one who stayed when everyone else left. The story ends on a warm May evening. Caleb was walking the pack through the park. The sun was setting, casting a golden, amber glow over the city, turning the glass of the skyscrapers into sheets of fire. Grace walked perfectly at his side, her head held high. Ranger was busy investigating a squirrel, and Milo was trotting happily along, his tail held like a banner. An old man sitting on a park bench watched them pass. "Beautiful dogs, son," he called out. "You've done a fine job with them." Caleb stopped and looked down at Grace. She looked back at him, her brown eyes clear and full of a profound, unspoken understanding. "They did the work," Caleb replied with a faint smile. "I just gave them a place to do it." As they walked on, Disappearing into the lengthening shadows of the park, the city felt different. It was still loud, still crowded, and still chaotic, but it was no longer cold. Caleb Morgan was no longer a soldier in exile. He was a man who had found his home, not in a building, but in the eyes of a creature he had refused to abandon. And as you reflect on this journey, remember, goodness is never a commodity. It is a choice we make in the quiet moments, in the snow, and in the face of indifference. It is the only thing in this world that, once given, grows until it covers the earth. May you always have the courage to stop, to kneel, and to recognize the grace waiting in the frost. Amen.